The alarm had been an old, stubborn thing, its ringtone borrowed from a friend, and now tying Cleide to a rhythm she could not afford to miss. She turned it off with a practiced thumb, sat up, and felt the familiar ache along her shoulders, sleep that had been interrupted and stitched together in fragments, like the hem of a dress hastily mended. Outside, the sky in Capão Redondo was a hard, indifferent gray. Inside, the kitchen smelled of coffee and frying onions. Donna Marley already at the stove, moving with the quiet economy of someone who had learned to make small amounts stretch into mornings. Cleide dressed in the half-light, smoothing the collar of the blouse she had ironed the night before, tucking her resume into a clear plastic folder that made the pages look official and less fragile. She had printed 2 copies, both carefully updated: courses, a short internship at a small accounting firm, the volunteer work at the community center where she tutored children in mathematics. Each line was a small argument against the past, a polite insistence that she could belong somewhere else. She checked the clock, 5:05. The train from the southern terminus would take more than an hour if everything went right. Buses were punctual only when they felt like it. The interview at Costa Investments was set for 8:30 on Paulista. It was an interview that could change the ledger of her life. No exaggeration, just arithmetic. A stable salary, the chance to stop borrowing money from neighbors, to finally help with the bills that always looked larger than the wage paid for effort. She repeated the address to herself like a prayer, a strategy. Avenida Paulista, 1230. Focus, steady breath, don't think about the rent due next week. Outside, the morning air had that specific Sao Paulo density, diesel and damp earth, a scent of jagged concrete softened by someone's laundry on a line far below. Cleide walked to the bus stop, clutching her folder, rehearsing answers under her breath. She had prepared for the classic questions: strengths, weaknesses, where she saw herself in 5 years, but she had also prepared for the small human ones. Tell us about a time you took initiative. How do you handle pressure? She had stories ready like spare coins for different machines. The bus to the metro was packed, everyone folding themselves into equal compact shapes. People read with tired faces, scrolled on phones with small, private anxieties. Her stop came. She pushed through, then the familiar descent into the city's veins. The metro, which smelled of human bodies and rain, which shook with purpose and moved with the efficiency of a machine that would not wait for any one person's fate. The platform at Praça da República was a sliver of heat inside the cooler tunnel. Commuters pressed against each other like questions. Cleide kept her folder close to her chest. The concrete ceiling had the cold geometry of an institution, announcements repeated in that formal, impersonal voice, telling every person to watch the gap between platform and train. People jostled. A child's cry, a shrill, unpracticed sound cut through the mass, dissonant. Cleide saw the little girl before she understood how she'd noticed her. A small knot of yellow backpack and hair, face streaked with tears, standing alone near the edge of the platform. The child's hand clutched a ticket to no destination, fingers white and knuckled. The crowd was an indifferent sea. Adults moved around her as if she were the station's scenery. The girl's eyes met Cleide's like a small, urgent comet. Something in her chest tightened. She glanced to her right. The train was due in 2 minutes, according to the clock. She pictured herself in the glass conference room in Avenida Paulista. Lights, air conditioning, a panel of serious faces with more paper than faces. She could hear the imaginary question, "Why did you want to work here?" and the answer she had practiced. The train wouldn't wait. Her life would not wait. The girl's hand reached out to a man's sleeve and found only a distance. An announcement said, "Portas vão se fechar." A man with briefcase moved past, not noticing the child. Somewhere a heel clicked sharply. Cleide's rational timetable, the careful construction of her future, unraveled by the simple geometry of a small hand in a crowd. She could have stepped away, pretended not to see, timed the train and let happenstance decide. She could have kept her folder close and boarded. But the sight of the girl, the sound of that thin cry, made the other answer, the one from her chest, not her head, louder. She crossed the platform. It took only a moment to be beside the child, to crouch and hold her hand. The smallness fit into Cleide's palm as if it had always been part of her life to protect tiny things. The girl's name came out in between hiccups, Cecilia, and the world shrank to that syllable. Cleide tried to ask the simple questions. Where do you live? What's your mother's name?
but answers were a jigsaw of half-words and street names that slipped out from between sobs. "Está bem," Cleide said, because it was all she could give in Portuguese that felt honest. "You're all right. I'm going to help you." She wrapped her jacket around the girl's shoulders, felt the dampness of tears against linen. She checked her phone. No signal for an instant, then a flurry of messages from a cousin, a friend asking for a favor. She typed a quick message to the number on the back of her resume. "Running late. Please wait." She knew it would be hollow. The status lights of her phone blinked back as indifferent as the platform lights. The train arrived with a roar. People shoved inside as always. Cleide held Cecilia's hand and stepped back, away from the mass that had started to close the doors. The platform seemed to tilt.
A young woman who worked for the metro staff approached, professional and gentle, speaking into a small radio. "We need to check the CCTV," she said. A policeman with the fold of a municipal badge knelt, asking the child questions in a softer voice than you'd expect from uniformed authority. The tickets drawer in the station office was full of old obligations. Someone called the lost child number, and a tired woman at a counter made a note. Cleide called the number on her confirmation email for Costa Investments as she walked away from the train. The man who answered at HR had a corporate voice trained to remove trauma from language. "Miss, we can't keep the panel waiting indefinitely. We had another candidate who arrived on time. If you want, we can consider you for another round, but it would be later in the month." The sentence had the finality of a closed elevator door. Cleide's mouth was dry. She explained, briefly, the girl, the platform, the police. The man made a sound like sympathy, but not committed. "You understand our protocol," he said. "Punctuality is essential." There was no anger in his voice, only a statement of metric value. She tried to argue for an interview that same day. They offered a recess for emergencies. Funny, she thought, that emergencies were only considered for the white-collar kind. She was about to hang up when the other voice, the girl's voice, interrupted. A small request for water, for her mother. Cleide promised both. She left a number, not expecting much. She felt the folder in her hand as if it were heavier, as if the pages now absorbed the weight of a choice. The police station was smaller than she'd imagined, a windowless room with a plastic fan doing the best it could. A clerk with spectacles typed their names into a computer. Cecilia sat on a plastic chair, her small legs swinging. A woman, Nusa, hovered nearby, a longtime neighbor who sometimes helped out with odd jobs at the building Cleide lived in. She had seen Cleide with children at the center and had offered to come along. Dona Marley had arrived from the kitchen when she heard a call. "My daughter has encountered a lost child." She held her own worry in the way mothers do, as a physical ache behind the ribs. Phone calls were made. Names were said into the receiver with a nervous reverence. Then, after a time that felt both too long and too short, a car horn sounded outside, a dignified, swift thing. The policeman went to the window and then back to his desk, asking the clerks to be ready. He left a thick silence in the room. Cleide noticed the way Cecilia straightened, as if she had heard someone she recognized. The man who stepped into the station was not someone you could miss. He had the slow certainty of someone who had never needed to hurry through a crowd. His coat was tailored. His shoes had that particular way of aligning with high-grade sidewalks. He moved with an economy of motion that had cost money and intention. For a moment, Cleide saw him as a blur of wealth, the kind the favela kids in her neighborhood spoke about in half-myths, and then he stopped, his eyes looking for the child. When he reached the chair, he did not look inside the folder. He did not ask for papers. He dropped to his knees in front of the small, damp-faced girl and spoke her name with an urgent tenderness that was almost a surprise. "Cecilia?" His voice cracked, as if it were not used to speaking that soft. The child launched herself across the space, into an embrace that transformed the room. The man's face tightened as if he had been hit with a memory. "Thank God," he said. His hands trembled as he took her from Cleide. He looked up, finally seeing the woman who had stayed when another person might have left. "You found her?" he asked, disbelief folding into gratitude. Cleide told the short version, the timeline of platform to station. The man's jaw worked. A reporter's instinct for names and addresses would have noticed the small pin on his lapel, C. Costa, in a script that suggested a family crest, yet no one in that room needed confirmation. The man was Jonas Costa, the owner of Costa Investments, the firm where Cleide had been scheduled to interview. He was, in that unremarkable police office, both father and a figure larger than the room. The way he looked at her then was complicated, a mix of apology, relief, and, there was no easy term for it, something akin to alarm. He reached for his phone and called his assistant. Words came fast, clipped, and without the soft bureaucracy that had answered Cleide's call earlier. He asked about Cecilia's whereabouts in the past hour, about the routes she had taken, about whether she had been traveling with someone. Then he turned to Cleide. "I owe you more than I can say," Jonas said. Gratitude swelled in his voice, but there was another current beneath it, an awareness of time lost, of a father's failure that couldn't be fixed with money. "Can I buy you a coffee?"
At least a thank you that is not in an office? Cleide's hands were still damp from holding the girl's. She thought of the interview, the HR voice, the city maps that had been drawn on her mind. She thought of the folder, heavy with possibility. She thought of the rent and the bills, and the small, steady build of her life. He seemed in that moment like an abrupt new axis. She measured a response like someone weighing money. No, she said first, because it came easier. You don't owe me anything. I couldn't leave a child. It was a sentence she believed as much as she wanted the world to believe it. It was also the truth. Jonas's expression shifted. There was a faint, almost imperceptible exhale. He pushed his hand through his hair, a gesture that made him look suddenly human in a way the coat had not. You did more than help, he said. You stopped my heart from breaking this morning. I'm not sure I can explain how much that matters.
Someone suggested he pay the station fee for the lost child procedure. Jonas waved it off. He offered instead his card, simple and expensive, and then, awkwardly, an invitation that startled Cleide. We're going to Palista. If you don't mind, would you come with us, to meet properly? I would like to thank you properly, not here. His voice held a formality that sought but did not demand acceptance. Cleide thought of the interview. She thought of the folder. She thought of the HR man's curt tone. She thought of Cecilia's hair curling slightly at the nape when she slept. She thought of Dona Marley waiting at home, and how she would explain, if she even could, that she had stayed to help a child and lost a chance. The reasons were practical and moral, braided together. I have an interview, she said, because the reality of rent was as persuasive as conscience. At Costa, her voice had a thin edge. The room froze. Even the fan seemed to slow. Jonas's eyes sharpened with a quick professional recognition. The name of his own firm, the address on his tongue like something she had not expected him to carry into this scene. You were at, he started. Then for a moment he laughed quietly, not derisive, but incredulous. Of all the things, he said, as if the city had conspired. You were going to Costa, the officer asked, half incredulous, half humanly curious. The police station had become a place where stories collided. Yes, Cleide said. Her breaths came measured. She inhabited the moment with the dignity she kept for herself. Interview at 8:30. Jonas looked at his watch and then at the station clock. He did the math in his head with a precision that had probably cost him hours over the years. Travel time, the delay, the offices. He was quiet for a second, and then he did something sudden. He took his phone, placed it on the counter, and made a call with that fast, decisive tone Cleide had heard earlier. Get my assistant, he ordered. I need to pull HR files. Someone who was scheduled for 8:30. Find her name. No, wait, I have her name. He gave the receptionist a number. Stay with her. Make sure she's taken care of. And lunch. Set something up. He didn't ask permission to act. He acted. After the call, he turned back to Cleide. I'm sorry, he said. Not for the obvious reasons, but for the way this must look. I want you to know I understand the cost of time. He paused, searching for a way to say what might repair more than just the lost interview. If you are free now, would you accept my apologies in person? Coffee, lunch, whatever you prefer. Cleide felt the tilt of power. He was offering something in a way that made it seem like an equal exchange, and yet every muscle in her remembered the ledger of her life, how much effort it would take for stability. She could hear the list of her options like a city map. Go to the interview and hope HR would be merciful. Stay and accept the lunch and whatever it might lead to.
She said, I can't take a lunch, but I can or I could come speak with someone in HR. I don't want to cause trouble. It was a careful refusal and an opening. Jonas rubbed his jaw. Then, in a gesture that surprised both of them, he bent slightly and looked directly at Cecilia in Cleide's arms. Would you be willing to come to our house for a test? He asked slowly, as if the words required rehearsal. To see how she behaves. We need someone today to be with her. We were supposed to have a nanny, but she... He stopped, and the admission hung delicate in the air, a household without the adult who should have been present. Cleide's mind negotiated. A test at a house in Jardine Europa would mean a different kind of work than the office she had been trained for. It would not be the job she had studied for, but it could be work with steady pay, and more importantly, it would allow her to be honest about herself in conversation with someone who had power to change terms. She could leave the interview behind as a closed door, or she could step into a room where daylight came through high windows, and the questions she would face would be about a child, about boundaries and discipline and warmth. Why would you ask that? She asked, not to be combative, but because the offer felt like an unexpected currency. Jonas looked at her with an openness she'd never seen in an executive's face before. Rawness. Because you stayed, he said simply. Because my daughter was found by you. Because I want someone who can be trusted, today, to observe. If it suits us both, we can talk about terms. I won't insult you with a dismissive proposition. I'll offer you a fair wage. If you don't want it after seeing the house, nothing is lost. It was a rehearsed honesty, the kind you use when you know something about your own deficiencies, about time stolen by work, about absence doubled by grief. Cleide heard the unspoken. This was not charity, but a need articulated by someone who had learned to use money to fix all problems except this one, the problem of being a dad. She asked the question that had been integral to everything else she had ever decided. What would the terms be? She was asking less about salary than about respect.
the ability to be consulted about Cecilia's routines, a voice and choices, and not to be exchanged for convenience. She had seen other women in jobs where their personal dignity was traded for a blouse of praise and then thrown away. She would not be another unpaid kindness. Jonas listened, perhaps surprised by the bluntness of her list. "We will negotiate properly," he said. "Paid time, legal contract, days off. You will have a say in how she is raised. If you agree to a trial day, we will sit with the lawyer who handles our household staff to put things formally. I promise you that. And if you decide the house is not for you, you will be reimbursed for your time." His tone was careful, as if he were naming an idea he had not often had to explain.
Noosa, who had been watching quietly, cleared her throat and added, "And if she needs to go home, she can. No one here will force anything." Her eyes met Cleide's with the kind of neighborly solidarity that belonged to a lifetime of shared hardships. Donna Marley touched Cleide's arm briefly, a small maternal gesture that said both warning and blessing. Cleide felt the weight of those small motions. She considered the folder in her hand, the candidacy it represented. She thought of the HR man's clipped voice. Then she thought of Cecilia's small face, newly safe for the moment, trusting. She thought of the rent, of the next day's grocery list, of Noosa's steady presence that might help with an extra pair of hands. "All right," she said finally, surprising herself with how steady her voice was. "One day, a trial. I'll come for the day. But I want it written. I want a contract, a salary that is clear, and I want agency in decisions about Cecilia's routine and education. I won't be anyone's secret." Jonas nodded. "Fair," he said. He reached for a pen and a small notebook he carried like a talisman. He wrote numbers and names with an economy of movement. He asked for her phone number again, for the best time to reach her, for what she needed to be compensated for losing her interview. She told him simply, "If I miss that interview, I will need a day rate that corresponds with my lost potential. I won't accept charity. I'll accept work." She named a figure. Jonas's pen paused, not in disapproval but in calculation. He wrote the number down without comment. They agreed on a time, noon. A car would be waiting, and the address on Paulista would be the one where the first interview had been scheduled. He would have his assistant draw up a simple agreement. They would meet at the house. The arrangement was professional in form and fragile in its emotional core. Cleide called HR one more time. The voice on the other line was a shade gentler. "We'll reschedule," the man said after a moment that felt like purchase. "We'll consider your file. Come by when you can." It was not a promise, but it was not a dismissal either. It was a hinge left slightly open. She stood on the sidewalk outside the station with Cecilia in her arms and watched as Jonas kissed the child's hair, in a gesture that was both paternal and apologetic. He turned to Cleide and offered another kind of mercy, an envelope with a number inside, an immediate compensation for the hour she had lost. He called his driver, and the car idled like an animal ready to carry them somewhere else. Cleide glanced at the folder again, and then closed her hand around it. Her life had been shaped by small choices that looked insignificant at the time. A class here, an extra hour at the center there, and yet here, in the wet brightness of a morning that had tasted of diesel and fried onions, the day had folded into a new possibility. She felt fear, terrible, useful fear, line up with a cautious curiosity.
"Will you be all right?" she asked Cecilia, who had buried her face into Cleide's sleeve and was already quieter. Cecilia peered up, the light catching at the edge of her eyelashes. "You saved me," she said simply, as if that were both report and verdict. Cleide smiled, a short, honest thing. "We saved each other," she said, and believed it. The words did not resolve anything, only described a moment. Two strangers made briefly necessary to one another. Jonas watched that exchange as if cataloging it for later. "If you'll let me," he said to Cleide, "come by the house today. I'd like to make sure my family thanks you properly." She hesitated only a moment longer, long enough to call Donna Marley and leave instructions, long enough to let Noosa fuss over belongings. Then she handed the folder to her mother. "Keep this safe," she asked, trusting someone who had kept both her shoes and her hopes in place for 23 years. Jonas offered his arm. The driver opened the back door. The leather interior smelled faintly of newness and something slightly medicinal, the kind of scent that comes with a house that has polished itself to invisibility. Cleide stepped into the car, the plastic folder pressed to her knees like a small shield. She watched Capão Redondo fall away in a blur of low houses and laundry lines, and a cityscape she recognized only by memory moved past the window. As they threaded through traffic, her phone vibrated with messages, texts from the woman at HR, a WhatsApp from a cousin with a laughing gif, a short line from Donna Marley that said,
Be careful. Remember your worth. She kept her thumb over the screen and stared at the reflection of the city in the glass. She was going to a house where the walls were made of a different economy, where mistakes could be paid for and grief could live in costumes of money and still feel lonely. Jonas spoke occasionally, polite and practical, where she had studied, the name of the community center, the kinds of food Cecilia preferred. He did not pry into the small, sharp edges of her life, how much she owed, the way the light in her apartment was a chemical lamp because the building's fixtures refused to cooperate. Yet in the way he asked about the community center, she felt a kind of respect that was beginning to matter. When the driver pulled up to the address in Giardini Ropa, the sidewalk there had a different rhythm, palm trees planted with architectural precision, tile patterns that looked like deliberate art. The front gate opened with an effortlessness she had seen only in magazines. A doorman in a pressed uniform stepped forward, greeting Jonas with a nod that acknowledged privilege and a command of manners. Cleide's world had always had such gates, on television, on glossy advertisements, in the rumors told at Nardi's, but this was her first time inside one. She felt for the first time that morning the weight of heartbeat against the ribs in a way that was not purely fear.
There was pride, too. She had made a choice and acted on it. A lost child had asked for help, and she had given it. The consequences were arriving like mail. At the threshold, Cecilia grabbed Cleide's hand and squeezed. Cleide looked down, meeting the small, sure gaze of a child who had already decided something about her. "You're coming back?" the girl asked softly. "For sure," Cleide promised, because she meant to keep that. It was not yet a bargain sealed, nor an allegiance. It was a promise of presence, and that was, in itself, a kind of work. They crossed the threshold together. The house smelled of citrus and clean wood. It hummed with the quiet competence of a well-run place. Noosa fell into a rhythm, finding things as if she had been there before, though she had not. The household staff glanced up with measured curiosity. The lunch offer waited like an exam she had not studied for. Jonas led them through a corridor that opened into rooms whole as chapters. Framed photographs with glossy smiles lined a mantel, images of family and of a woman whose face frequently appeared beside Jonas's in happier frames. Her absence was a presence that sat in each room like a remembered song. It was impossible to ignore. The house had a grief dressed in gilt and earnest wood. Noosa whispered to Cleide then, a small aside that belonged to women who understood the economy of choices. "You can set your terms," she said. "Don't let him think this is charity. You're needed, yes, but you're needed because you have skills, not because you are owed." Cleide nodded. Inside her, the train of ambition and the carriage of compassion pulled at different strings. She had missed an interview, yes, her life had detoured, but the detour had brought her to a threshold where bargaining was possible. She would not accept humiliation dressed as generosity. She would teach them, if she had to, what dignity looked like. Jonas stood in the doorway of a study, watching the small exchange between the staff, the child, and the woman he had just saved. He had been a man who built portfolios and reduced risk to spreadsheet columns. Today, his portfolio felt like a child in someone else's arms. He had no metrics for gratitude, only a private ledger of absence and an ache he had not been able to ink into better habits. He turned to Cleide and asked quietly, "Will you help me find a way back to being present? Not as an obligation, but as a habit? Will you teach me?" The question startled her with its frankness. It was not a romantic request, not yet. It was a request for instruction, for partnership in an area where he had always delegated. It asked for the kind of bravery that was not romantic but practical, to teach an adult to be a father. Cleide thought of the community center and the children she had taught. She imagined nights sitting with a child over math, explaining the logic of numbers until faces lit up like lamps.
She understood, in a practical way, what it meant to make patterns repeat in a life. Could she ask the owner of Costa Investments to change his schedule, to trust her voice in a way that would not be used like a proof of success? Could she ask for boundaries and a contract in a house where both money and grief had always held the first draft? She found herself answering before she had mapped the consequences. "I can try," she said, "but I'll need terms. I will work with Cecilia, yes. I will expect a formal job offer, payment, and respect for my decisions about her routine. I will not be treated like a domestic ghost. And if this does not work, I will walk away with the day's pay." Jonas's eyes softened into something close to relief. "It's a deal then," he said. "We'll have the paperwork drawn. Today is a trial day. Afterwards, we'll sit, sign, and make it right." They arranged details with the mechanical care of people trying to cover human fault with the architecture of contracts. Jonas's assistant was summoned. A lawyer was placed on standby. These practicalities made the imagined transaction real. Cleide felt the small thrill of a ledger that now had a line that read, "Something in, something out."
The midday light slanted through high windows as lunch was prepared, and the house hummed as if it had been waiting for this new rhythm. For Cleide, the day had already been long. A missed interview, a small rescue, the sudden confluence of two lives that would normally remain parallel lanes. She had stepped into a different city, one of tiled sidewalks and polite engines. She would spend the day watching the ways privilege tended to rearrange itself around grief, and also the ways small, patient actions rearranged the hearts inside grand houses. She would tell the assistant what she expected. She would make sure her terms were recorded. She would teach a man who had been competent in markets to be competent in presence. Yet even as she agreed, a line of unease traveled down her back. She had not chosen this path for glamour. She had chosen it for survival, and for the quiet hope that steadiness could be built by regular income. Here, in the house smelling of citrus, her future budded in an unexpected soil. Cecilia, now bright with a banana, sat at a table that was almost too large for her small hands. She drew on a paper that had been placed before her, a sketch of a family. Cleide watched the child draw two adults and an animal that could have been a dog or a cloud. The picture looked like a promise. As the lunch plates were set, Jonas excused himself to take a call. Cleide folded her hands in her lap and looked at the briefcase she had placed on a chair beside her. The folder with her resume lay on another chair, a reminder of the life she had paused. For a heartbeat, she imagined herself back in a glass office, answering questions with her Hearst patience.
Then Cecilia lifted her head and smiled at Cleide, and the imaginary office felt like a distant island. A watchful woman in a neat dress, someone introduced as the household manager, came with a small packet of papers and a pen. "We can draw a preliminary contract here," she said. "Nothing binding until you and Mr. Costa sign formally, but a memorandum of understanding, if you wish." The offer had the formality of a concession that sought to respect both parties' needs. Cleide read through the lines: hours, days off, compensation, her fingers tracing numbers as if to feel their solidity. The numbers were fair, not extravagant. They were enough to pay the rent for months, not to clear back debts. She would have to continue working toward the career she had wanted, but the salary would allow breathing room, a small margin. It was honest. It respected reality. She signed the preliminary paper, each stroke a small defiant act against a life that had once taught her to accept crumbs. Jonas reappeared, his expression harder now, tempered by business calls and public demands, but softened when he saw the signature. He sat down across the table from her for the first real conversation since the station. "I want to be clear," he said. "This isn't charity. You're not an emergency solution. If you come with rights. I expect you will teach me, but I will not use you as," he searched for the right word, "a symbol. You will have a proper contract. I will respect your decisions about Cecilia's schedule and schooling." Cleide met his gaze. There was an honesty in him she had not expected, an admission, thin but visible, that he had been absent. "And I want to be clear too," she said. "I didn't come here to be someone's goodwill. I'm not interested in being proof of anything. I need work that respects what I know how to do. I need to be part of decisions, and I need this day to be paid as we agreed." Jonas nodded. Agreed. There it was, the exchange sealed by language and a pen. The household manager filed the paper away, and Noosa gave Cleide a small, approving smile. The rain started as they ate, thin at first, then building into a steady noise against the windows. The city seemed to dim, and the house took on a different light, as if the weather could collect secrets and pour them on the glass. Rain had a way of making things intimate. The tap of water against panes was like a reminder that the world cleaned itself slowly. Inside the house, as the day settled and the small routines began, fruit cut into little pieces, a quiet story for Cecilia, a nap arranged on a sofa, Cleide felt the strange sensation of a life splitting into two narratives. One was the report she had carried for years, the plan to climb, step by step, into a stable career. The other was the unexpected path that had opened when she chose human closeness over punctuality. She watched Cecilia sleep, the small chest rising and falling, and she understood, with a clarity sharp as a knife, that whatever this day would become, it had already begun to teach her the language of belonging that no interview could teach. There were things you learned when you stayed, the shape of a laugh, how to braid hair, the trust that accumulated in the quiet. The rain increased its rhythm. Outside, the city blurred into watercolor. Inside, Cleide prepared to stay for the trial. She had kept her dignity through bargaining. She had insisted on agency. She had been heard. But the fact that she had sat in a car belonging to the family was not a cure for the long history of trying to be seen. As the afternoon wore on, she noticed things.
The way a framed photo of Jonah's late wife stood in the study, with an expression that was preserved more perfectly than the person had ever been. The way the house's staff moved like a practiced chorus, and the way the name Costa carried weight just by being repeated. She also noticed the way Jonas watched his child, sometimes tenderly, sometimes with a distance that seemed to be made of schedules and meetings. It was not malice, it was occupation. She thought of the many fathers she had seen at the community center, present in body, absent in the way patience needed to be practiced. She felt in a sudden motion the desire to make this man practice being present in a steady way. As evening came, the house softened. The day had been a series of small calibrations, a child's nap, a signed paper, a lunch where conversation treaded carefully around the absent woman whose photograph still held memory. Cleide had been tested, and had tested the house in return. She had not resolved anything yet. She had only placed her footprint on a new floor. When the rain sounded like a distant ocean, Jonas walked over to her, carrying a small cup of tea he had not offered her earlier. He sat down close enough that she could feel the warmth, but far enough to maintain the boundaries she had insisted on. "Thank you," he said simply. It was a man's gratitude, stripped of ceremony. It still had the capacity to be sincere. Cleide accepted the tea. It tasted like warmth and newness and something else she could not name. She had taken a detour this morning she had not planned. She had missed an interview she had worked for, and yet the day had not been empty. It had been full of the sort of labor that shifts people, not always in ledger entries, but in the slow way of hearts and homes. Outside, the rain slowed to a soft, steady tapping. Inside, small lights glowed like cautious promises. She had agreed to a trial. She had not yet promised her future. The city, wet and luminous, kept its distance. But in the hush after rain, with a child asleep, and a man who had to relearn fatherhood in the house, something else pressed forward. The possibility that kindness, when offered without calculation, could detour destiny.
The house settled around them as if accommodating a new rhythm. The days ahead would require negotiations, boundaries, and a patient proving of wills and affections. For now, Cleide let herself breathe. She had chosen once this morning, and the choice had opened a door. And when night came, a single light in the room reflected in glossy photographs, as if to suggest the way memory could be cut into rooms and kept polished like silver. Cleide darned the cup in her hands until the warmth traveled through her fingers. The house had 1,000 soft mechanisms, schedules, staff, the polite hush of rooms that had been taught to breathe in a certain way. For the first time that week, she allowed herself the notion that the detour she had taken that morning might lead somewhere not merely tolerable, but honest. The trial day became a week. The week stretched into a month that smelled alternately of baby shampoo and citrus polish. The hours were rigid at first, mornings for lessons and play, afternoons for naps and small errands. Nusa ran the kitchen like a captain. A household manager kept a ledger of babysitters' hours, appointments, and school forms. Cecilia, who had been bewildered and tight with the memory of lostness, loosened into routines. She learned to eat at set times. She learned that Cleide braided hair with a certain speed and precision. She learned how to draw people with consistent eyes. Cleide found herself inventing new little rituals at the end of the day, a song that Cecilia favored, a hand-wash ritual at the sink with lavender soap, and the child's sleepy gratitude became the kind of payment that could be felt rather than counted. There were practical matters to settle. Jonas, true to his word, arranged for a written contract. The lawyer who drafted it had the brisk efficiency of someone used to translating feelings into clauses. Cleide read every line. She asked questions about time off, about sick days for Cecilia, about whether she would be free to attend the community center's monthly coordination meeting. Those last requests carried a lifetime of small dignity behind them. Jonas listened. He asked the lawyer to add clauses for voice and consultation on school matters. He insisted the salary reflect the work's complexity. The agreement included a clear day rate for trial days, a notice period, and the promise of a formal performance review after 3 months. Not a charitable appraisal, but a standard evaluation. When she signed, the pen felt like a hinge. She also told Marta, the coordinator at the community center where she tutored on weekend afternoons, that she would have to stop the extra hours. Marta had already suspected something when Cleide's weekend shifts began to change. She put a hand on Cleide's forearm with a mix of pride and negotiation. "You earned this," she said, in a voice that had seen its share of goodbyes. "But we'll need to reorganize. We'll miss you." Cleide offered to help train a replacement, to write a short manual for the children so they would continue with their math. Marta protested until Jonas insisted on compensating the center for the loss of her time during the transition. Jonas's payment to the center was not a grand gesture, but a practical one. Funds to hire a substitute teacher for 2 months and materials for classes. Jonas made the transfer discreetly, and Marta accepted it with the contained gratitude of someone who knew how such sums could translate into continuity rather than spectacle. There were other practicalities. Cleide called the HR office where she had been passed over and confirmed the rescheduling they had promised. The message was more ambiguous than she would have liked, but it existed. She kept a slim hope in the back pocket of her mind that she could return to corporate work someday. For the moment, though, the household salary steadied the slow leak in her budget. She paid a debt to a neighbor who had once lent her a small sum during a difficult month. She fixed the leaking corner of her roof with a repairman Nusa arranged through the house's accountant. The small triumph of being able to pay for that work without having to ask for more favors sat in her like a hard-won coin. The house asked for work that went beyond routines. Cleide taught Cecilia how to tie shoelaces and how to line up crayons by color. She translated the stipulations in Jonas's lawyer speak into stories for the child, permission to watch cartoons, the rule that sweets were for after homework. She discovered talents she had not expected to be valuable, an ability to coax a stubborn child through a math problem without making the child feel small, a practical knack for arranging schoolbooks so they would be accessible, a steadiness in small emergencies, like when a fever spiked at night and Jonas's first instinct was to hand over a laptop and ask an assistant to call a doctor. Cleide, with her calm hands and a head that did not panic, called a pediatrician and gave the child acetaminophen with the kind of timing that felt like an offered anchor. Jonas learned in the same slow, halting way. He came to the house and asked questions that had nothing to do with markets. He asked what Cecilia preferred for breakfast. He asked which children at school were friends and which were quieter. He wanted to know whether the school they were considering was caring or merely efficient. At first, his attempts at bedtime were short and awkward. He would read the wrong page in a story, skip an illustration because an email demanded attention. But then, one evening when the power failed for a block, he sat with a candle and read chapter after chapter without glancing at his phone. The small achievement of staying through a storm became a kind of apprenticeship. He learned how to watch a child's face for boredom and for delight. He learned how to say, "I'll be there," and then to mean it.
Grief remained in the rooms like a folded cloth on a chair. The photograph of Jonas's late wife didn't disappear from the mantel. Instead, the edges around it softened as conversation found ways to contain the memory. Jonas spoke of her at odd times, in fragments, about the way she had loved holidays, about a scarf she had knitted that still smelled faintly of lavender, about a tiny ritual they'd had on Saturdays. He never manipulated these stories to gain sympathy. He told them as if he were sharing notes from a course he had failed to pass. Cleide did not attempt to erase the past. Rather, she learned to set it at a place on the table where it could be seen and respected without chaining the present to sorrow. Tension came because life is often a test of small ethics. There were evenings when Jonas's calendar swallowed him, board meetings that ran into dinner, outside obligations that translated into silence at home. Once, late on a Tuesday, he accepted an impromptu flight to a shareholder meeting in Rio that would take him out of town for 3 days, his assistant promising calls and conference lines. Cleide was left with a feverish Cecilia and a schedule that needed someone physically present. She coped. She always coped. But the emptiness of his absence accumulated in a way that felt reputationally heavy. She rehearsed in private the ways she would ask for more, not to demand affection as recompense, but to demand consistent parenting. When Jonas returned, sheepish and apologetic, she told him plainly that she needed him to be there for the things a contract could not mandate, like birthdays and the monthly parent-teacher meeting. He heard it as a rebuke and as a request. He heard it like a financial forewarning of neglect's cost. He adjusted his calendar. There were also moments when Cleide felt the keen sting of class difference, not as caricature, but in the small everyday slights. At a charity dinner where the guests were polished and the wine came in sommelier-led courses, a woman whose name Cleide did not recall commented in the passing way women sometimes do, "The staff looks so lovely," as if Cleide were an exhibit rather than a person. An assistant introduced her with a brief, almost apologetic phrase that flattened the years of study printed on the folder now tucked into a drawer. Cleide felt the old reflex to shrink. Instead, she kept steady. She corrected the assistant afterward in a quiet voice. "Introductions should include name and role," she said. "Respect is not contingent on place settings." Jonas, who had been across the room and heard nothing at first, later sought her out and apologized not for the woman's words but for the fact that he had not been present enough in those small moments to defend her. He began, clumsily at first, and then more naturally, to clarify before social gatherings that she was to be treated as an equal in conversation, not as a decorative domestic. The most difficult moment came when a photograph circulated in a weekend social column. A candid snapped of Cleide stepping from the family car at a cultural opening in the center. The headline was innocuous, but the comments below were not. An old-world sort of gossip that assumed tidy narratives about who belonged where. Cleide's cheeks burned with a heat that had nothing to do with shame and everything to do with exposure. She had not wanted her life to be reduced to a footnote. Jonas, who had grown used over a lifetime to public speculation, noticed how the silence wounded her and made a small, concrete amends. He arranged for a short statement clarifying that she was a professional hired with full contract. He spoke plainly with the household manager about security and privacy. He learned to see that protecting someone was not always about money. Sometimes it was about public defense and private affirmation. The months shaped them in other ways. Cleide continued to study on the side, an accounting seminar in the evenings through an online course she had promised herself when she was younger. She passed an exam that gave her a certificate and made a small note in her phone about the next step in her certification. Money lent by the household's salary allowed her to schedule time for study rather than double shifts. She still swept the idea of a corporate job across the back of her mind. A day would come, perhaps, when she would re-enter those interview rooms with more experience than when she had first sat in front of a panel. Jonas never asked her to abandon those plans. On the contrary, he asked, tentatively at first, what he could do to support her studies. The request surprised them both. It was another kind of currency, an offer to invest rather than to save her from change. Love arrived the way such things often do, irregular, in gestures rather than proclamations. It was the way he learned to tie Cecilia's shoelaces with clumsy fingers. It was the way she laughed at a story his late wife had once told, and he heard the laugh as permission. It was the small moment when Jonas, exhausted from an all-day board retreat, came home and found the three of them at the kitchen table, Cleide grading a child's homework, Cecilia explaining in rapid Portuguese why a cartoon character was wrong, and he felt quietly that none of his meetings had been as necessary that day as the steady, small domestic work that filled the kitchen with sound. Still, attraction was not an event. There were no fireworks that obliterated the past. There were only accumulations. Cleide was careful not to allow sentiment to override prudence. She had insisted on terms, on a contract, on voice. Jonas was careful not to let guilt be his route to affection. He could spend money to fix a leak, but he could not spend money to create trust.
Their intimacies were conscionable, a shared joke over a burnt pot of vegetables, a conversation about a teacher who needed patience, a shared small triumph when Cecilia finally read a paragraph out loud without help. The storm came in the late spring, abrupt and enormous. Sheets of rain hammered the city. São Paulo's gutters filled, and traffic rerouted itself like a nervous animal. The house took on a particular hush, windows dark, the staff quieter than usual. The rain had the kind of pressure that made rooms feel like caves. It asked people to shelter more than usual. That night, Jonas was due back from a trip that had been important for investors. A call about delays came through. The flight would land late. He texted once, then twice. Rain beat against panes. The house settled. Cecilia fell asleep early, exhausted by the storm's demand for attention. The house hummed with the small after-chores of a settled household. Cleide sat where she often sat in the evenings now, near the window that looked out over the small courtyard, a lamp on, a notebook of schedules beside her. She was reading through a list of books to bring to Cecilia's school project when the front door opened without fanfare. He stepped into the hall with the wetness of a man who had stepped into sea. His hair lay flat from the rain, his jacket collected droplets, and the hurried lines around his mouth had deepened. He looked at the room as if asking permission to be less formal. Cleide rose without drama, ordinary and calm. He placed his bag down, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, two people who had, over months, learned the art of watching another adapt. He moved closer, and the house felt too small for the space between them. He spoke then, in a voice that had been smoothed by months of trying to say what he felt without resorting to cliché. "I have been keeping a ledger of things I owe," he said. "Not in monetary terms, those I can pay, but things I have not been present for. I don't know how to make that ledger balanced. I only know that when I walked in tonight and saw Cecilia asleep and you here with the lamp on, I thought of how many times I didn't come to the simplest things. I'm tired of being someone who pays for presents instead of being present." Cleide did not answer immediately.
She had learned in the months they had weathered to press feelings through the sieve of practicality. She asked instead, plainly, "What are you asking for?" He watched the rain slide down the window. "Not forgiveness," he said slowly, "but permission to learn, to be taught how to be a father properly, to be asked for things you need me to do and to be expected to do them, to be part of decisions, not as a guest, but as someone who shows up." His voice trembled with an honesty that felt rarer than wealth. "And if, along the way, I find that there's more, that I love you, I want to say it, but not in a way that places it like a price on something."
I want to ask you, are you willing to teach me to be whole in ways I have not been? Cleide's hands, folded in her lap, tightened once. Her life had taught her to measure sincerity by actions, not words. She remembered the morning on the platform, the weight of a resume against her ribs, the small, stubborn way she had refused to accept crumbs dressed as aid. She remembered the months of steady negotiation and the nights she had sat up with a feverish child. She also remembered that there were things she could not ask of a man because they belonged to the slow work of reciprocation, sharing of grief, the courage to change daily habits, to adjust meetings around a child's recital, to be publicly accountable for the small things. "You are asking for a lot," she said finally, "and you are offering what you can. I will teach you what I know. I will ask you to be present, and I will not be the woman who is capped because someone pays her to stay. I will be with you if we build a life that respects what I've already been." She looked at him steadily. "I will not sign away who I am, and I need to know you will accept that." He nodded as if she had given him a map. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small object that glinted like water, a ring, simple, unadorned. He did not kneel, he had never learned the theater of such gestures, but he did hold out the ring with both hands. "I used to think proposals were about spectacle," he said. "This is not spectacle. It is a promise I am asking to make, to try, to be present, to respect, to listen, and," his voice cracked, "to love you, if that is allowed." The room seemed to hold its breath. Cleide looked at the ring, then at Jonas's face, the man who had, over weeks and months, shifted his appointments and learned to braid hair and to iron a shirt without fuss. She thought of her mother waiting in a small apartment in Capão Redondo, of the friends who had watched her work double shifts and count out change. She thought of Cecilia's small hand asleep on the pillow. She could imagine a life that had room for both a career and a family, if the family would respect her independence. She took the ring and slid it onto her finger. It was neither a surrender nor a coronation. It was, in her view, an opening. "Yes," she said, and the word meant both provision and permission. "Yes, if we do this by agreement. Yes, if we keep the terms we signed. My voice on educational matters, the time I need to study, the respect for the life I have." He exhaled like someone who had been given air. They did not celebrate with a dramatic kiss. Instead, they sat, side by side, while the rain slid down the window like soft applause. Cecilia woke, as if on cue, murmured something about dreams, and climbed between them with the easy ownership children have of the present. Jonas slid an arm around both of them, and for the first time in as long as Cleide could remember, he did not check his phone for a call that would pull him away.
They told Cecilia, later, in the soft privacy of the bedroom, that they wanted to be a family. Jonas turned to the child, as if asking permission not only for a man's request, but for the quiet consent a child has to the shape of her own life. "Do you want Cleide to be part of our family?" he asked gently. Cecilia, rubbing sleep from her eyes, considered the question with the stark logic of a child who believed the world could be arranged by simple answers. She climbed down, went to the small table where her drawings were kept, and returned with the family portrait she had drawn months earlier, 2 adults and a scribble that could have been a bird or a dog. She handed it to Cleide with the solemnity of a priest offering communion. "Yes," she said simply, "this is the family." It was the kind of blessing that was small and enormous at once. The months that followed were not a tidy run toward a headline. There were disagreements, like a night when Jonas, in the stress of a legal negotiation, snapped about a missed deadline and forgot momentarily the humility required in their household. Cleide, tired from an overlong week, met him with a coolness that forced both of them to the table. They talked for hours, about fairness, about how power can be used unconsciously.
Jonas apologized not with money, but with changed behavior. He took over certain school runs. He attended parent-teacher conferences without his phone. He asked for feedback at the end of the week. He did not convert to expertise overnight. He simply practiced. Her pride remained intact. When donors came to the community center to view the new materials Jonas had arranged for them to buy, books, new tablets for students, Cleide stood beside Martha and explained how the programs worked. She took questions from funders with confidence. Jonas watched, sometimes from the back of the room with an expression that was part admiration and part astonishment. The man who had once reduced risk to spreadsheets had through necessity learned to value the humility of small commitments.
They invited neighbors from Capão Redondo, the staff from the house, the teachers from Cecilia's school, a few friends from Jonas's world who had been steady and true. The ceremony took place in the midday light of a small chapel with simple flowers. Cleide walked in without a veil, holding an envelope with a note for herself. 3 sentences she had written on a bus one afternoon about what she wanted from life. Jonas waited with a mixture of temperate grace and visible nerves. Cecilia, in a dress Cleide helped choose, held a small ribbon and declared that she would be the one to make sure everyone ate cake. They exchanged vows that were quieter than the ones in magazines. Cleide spoke of agency and belonging. She asked for a partner who would be present and honest, and who would not confuse guilt with devotion. Jonas promised to be teachable, to protect privacy, and to accept that love would be measured in 100 small acts rather than a single speech. They signed the papers in a small office afterward, again an intention to form that Cleide appreciated, and then they went to the house where an unostentatious celebration took place. There were speeches, some funny, some tender. There were notes from people who had unexpectedly been part of the tale. Marta sent a bouquet and a note. Nusa served a cake with practiced kindness, and Dona Marley declared, loudly and with the force of a matriarch, that her daughter had always picked well. Marriage did not end negotiation. It formalized it. A week after the wedding, Jonas and Cleide sat down to revise aspects of the household contract, this time with the knowledge that their lives had become a family. They redrew terms that applied to vacations, to parental leave if Cecilia ever needed it, to how decisions about schooling would be made. They planned a small scholarship for the community center, not as a publicity stunt, but as a measured fund to guarantee a tutoring slot for 5 children every year. Jonas took the lead in the parental meetings with a newfound humility. He listened more than he spoke, then asked questions. The city around them continued to press. There were market reports and meetings and the small violences of urban life. But within the house, a new set of rhythms had been established, some borrowed from the neatness of Jonas's world, others from the improvisation of Cleide's. They were not identical, and sometimes friction flared. Once, when Jonas's sister presumed to question a parenting decision Cleide had made about a school rule, Cleide refused to be lectured by a person who had not earned the right to advise her on everyday life. Jonas, standing by, interfered on her behalf in a tone that would have been foreign to him a year earlier. The moment, small and private, mattered because it signaled an unlearning and relearning of dignity. Years passed in the shape of small, obvious improvements.
They renovated a shed in the backyard into a modest workshop where Cecilia, now older, kept her art supplies and where Cleide sometimes wrote accounting notes on the back of receipts. The community center won a small local award for its literacy program. Cleide's name was announced at the ceremony, and she heard applause that had the exacting warmth of people who had seen the work from the ground up. Jonas, who once had connected charity to reputational benefit, now sat at a donor's table and listened to teachers explain their needs. He had learned to separate good intentions from practical support. They bought a small apartment closer to Capão Redondo for Dona Marley, who refused to leave the neighborhood that had raised her. Cleide visited Sunday mornings, bringing a loaf of bread and news of the week. The old rooms hummed with the same smells of fried onions and coffee. Cecilia learned to share language, sometimes switching, mid-sentence, to Portuguese words that had the exacting texture of home. She teetered between the two worlds like a bright bird, fluent and unbothered. There were practical successes that mattered for survival. The salary allowed Cleide to go to an accounting course in the evening and to pass a certification that made her eligible for junior finance roles. Jonas never once suggested she give up that pursuit. Instead, he hired extra after-school help so she could study. "I need your voice in the household," he said once, "but I also want you to have options you choose on your own." The phrasing mattered. It was not a surrender of responsibility, but an offering of support. The family did not erase difference. There were moments when the world around them reminded them of the lines that had once separated their lives.
On a morning when the subway broke down and Cleide had to take a slower bus with neighbors who complained about fares, Jonas came to the community center unannounced and sat in the 5th row of a parent meeting. He listened to complaints about school canteens and noisy buses, and when the meeting ended, he engaged with concrete ideas for how to improve traffic safety near the school. The community's response was a mixture of surprise and cautious approval. They had not expected a man of his height to attend such a meeting without cameras. Jonas later told Cleide that he had spent the ride home learning how often he had relied on other people, unpaid labor and invisible efforts, to make his life work. "I don't want us to be the kind of family that forgets who we are or where we come from," he said. "And I don't want us to be the kind of family that thinks money can fix everything." The story, as a story tends to, ended not with a single glorious moment, but with a pattern of days that, looked at from a distance, spelled out a life. On a cool evening, months later, the 3 of them, Cleide, Jonas, and Cecilia, sat by a small table in the courtyard.
A string of lights made halos over the plants. The distant city had its dull glow. They ate a simple dinner and compared notes. Cecilia insisted on telling a story about a classmate who had learned to tie shoelaces. Jonas promised to attend the upcoming school play. Cleide made a list of things she wanted to study next. Donna Marley arrived with a small jar of dulce de leche, insisting they try it. Nasa handed slices of cake and sat nearby, the kind of presents that had outlived seasons. Outside the courtyard, Capão Redondo was visible in the distance as a smudge of memory. Low houses, laundry lines, the rhythms of a neighborhood that had taught Cleide the language of small mercies. They were not pretending those worlds had merged into one seamless place. They simply occupied the messy human space between them. Later that night, when the lights had been turned down and the house placed itself into a gentle hush, Cleide walked to the shelf where the folder of her old resume rested, now edged with years and notes. She thumbed the pages and found, tucked inside, the interview confirmation she had missed on the platform. It was a small relic that no longer ached in the way it had the morning she had chosen to stop. She had lost an interview, yes, but she had not lost herself. She had been given other chances to build a life of dignity and to exercise her will in the matters that mattered. Jonas stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, appreciating the quiet attentiveness with which she treated the present. "Do you ever think," he asked softly, "about that morning? The station?" She smiled, a private thing that carried 1,000 small histories. "Often," she said, "I think about how small hands have a way of reminding us what we owe to one another." He stepped in and kissed her hair, then sat beside her on the sofa. They did not speak for a long while. The house hummed around them, and the city slept beyond the walls. Cecilia's breathing came steady from the next room. Before they turned in, Cleide placed a hand on the small ring on her finger, the ring Jonas had given her the night of rain. It had become a symbol of negotiated life rather than a seal of rescue. It had become like the photograph on the mantel and the certificate on her wall, one more fact in the ledger of the life she was building. At dawn, she woke to the sound of coffee boiling in a distant part of the house. The morning had that particular Sao Paulo light again, flattened and eager, promising 100 small tasks. She dressed slowly, tying the blouse collar with the same motion she had practiced for years. She paused at the door of Cecilia's room, watching the child stretch and turn toward the morning. Outside, the city already moved.
A bus's hiss, a motorcycle's distant thrum, the call of a vendor setting up tables at the market. These sounds had the same density as years before, but now they were interwoven with new rhythms, school runs that were punctually made, notes to tutors that were answered, reminders in her phone with times set for study. Cleide left a small note on the kitchen table for Jonas, 2 lines about the day's meeting and a request he had asked her to remind him of. She felt not the old hunger, but a steadier appetite for what was possible. On the way to the community center later that week, she still went once a week to teach, refusing to lose the thread that had once steadied her. She paused at a bus stop and felt the city's pulse. A young woman with a child and an improvised sling sat beside her, exhausted and beautiful with the fatigue of work. The child, only months old, blinked and then reached a hand toward Cleide's face. She smiled and took the small hand. The image was simple, an echo of that morning on the platform. Some small acts repeat themselves across a life. Sometimes the hand you hold is the one that shifts your course. Sometimes the choice to stop a train and tend to a stranger's fear becomes the hinge for a series of decisions that are argued over, negotiated, and finally accepted. Cleide remembered the folder she had held that morning. The printed resume that had, for a time, seemed like the only map out.
It mattered less now. The work she did, both the paid work and the care that had no receipt, was a ledger of different sorts. Years later, when they would tell the story to friends, if they ever told it in full, they would not varnish the parts that had been difficult. They would tell of negotiations with lawyers and the awkwardness of a man learning to braid hair. They would tell of long nights and of the practical kindnesses that had steadied them, a driver who knew when to wait, a neighbor who brought a casserole, a teacher who sent a photo of a child reading for the first time. But perhaps the simplest truth was the one that had started it. A sudden, unavoidable hand in hers at a crowded platform. That one small stop of a moment. The city pressed on, indifferent and vast, but within it, a few lives had been rewoven by a single choice to help. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes small acts matter. If you'd like more tales like this, subscribe for more.